Good evening. I'm Patricia Vanskyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Lessons in the Jardin du Roi, Changes in Early Modern Botany with Lauren Cannady. The Lloyd Library was founded more than 140 years ago by three brothers who manufactured nature-based medicine. To support their research, they collected books about nature, including plants from around the world, going back hundreds of years. As a result, Lloyd Library collections demonstrate an intersection of science, art, and history. It should come as no surprise that gardening and the emerging field of botany figure heavily in Lloyd collections, and that Lloyd materials are the source of many discoveries, supporting the research of both botanists and art historians. This year's Curtis Gates Lloyd Fellow, Lauren Cannady, researched Lloyd materials, including notes from a student's botany classes in Paris in the early 1700s. Her findings led to a deeper understanding of modern empirical practices and knowledge networks. Lauren Cannady is an assistant professor of humanities at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. She holds a PhD in art history from New York University. Through her research and teaching, she explores artistic production and taxonomies of knowledge, integrating the histories of science, religion, technology, and labor. She's completing a book on early modern patterned gardens as sites of knowledge production and transmission. It's now my pleasure to welcome Lauren Cannady.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for that introduction, Patricia. Thank you very much. And I want to thank you and the wonderful Lloyd staff for providing such a productive fellowship period earlier this year. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm excited to spend the next hour talking about my research and how I've incorporated the Lloyd collections into my work. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I'm completing a book manuscript that Patricia mentioned titled Ornament as Idea, Thinking Through the Early Modern European Garden. This is a book about how naturalists, gardeners, and designers attempted to order the natural world in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. I'm particularly interested in vernacular knowledge and making a case for the importance of artistic and artisanal contributions to the production and circulation of knowledge about the natural world. There's a whole body of vernacular knowledge, things made and ideas circulated by artisans in botanic and pleasure gardens. And this body of vernacular knowledge is a way to think through how knowledge traveled differently in the pre-modern world. Academic gardens and treatises were critical to the emergence of botany as a discipline divorced from medicine. But the patterned pleasure gardens and vernacular botanicals produced by artisan gardeners played an equally critical role in the drive to impose control on an increasingly globalized world brought about by European colonialism. My fellowship period at the Lloyd was spent working on the chapter dedicated to the standardization and institutionalization of early modern botanical knowledge, specifically in the academic centers of Paris, Leiden, and Oxford. These were the cities with the oldest botanic gardens in Northwestern Europe. My talk today will largely focus on the Jardin du Roi in Paris, as Patricia mentioned, and I'll begin now, and I look forward to your questions after. We cannot yet say in what order we will arrange the plants, wrote the French physician and naturalist Denis Dodart in his 1676 Natural History of Plants, an encyclopedia of plants, many of which were growing in the Jardin du Roi, or the King's Garden in Paris. The garden was formally founded by Louis XIII in 1635 on the left bank of Paris, the same site in the 5th arrondissement where the Jardin des Plantes can be visited today. On the screen are two of the earliest images we have of the Jardin du Roi. Today, it's the Jardin des Plantes because following the French Revolution and the abolishment of the monarchy, the garden was rebranded with a new name. As the seat of the French monarchy and home to the prestigious University of Paris and its medical faculty, Paris was in need of an extensive garden dedicated to the instruction and study of medicine, anatomy, pharmacy, and botany, like those already established by Southern European universities in Pisa, Bologna, Padua, and Montpellier. The problem identified by Dodart of ordering and arranging flora was not literal. Since its founding, the organizational structure of the Paris Garden, which was meant to be utilized by the medical faculty and the students at the University of Paris, as well as naturalists and curious members of the aristocratic public. So the order of the garden was that of the parterre, or the ornamental bed. Describing the design at the Jardin du Roi, physician Guy de la Brosse explained, "The plants are arranged in their squares, and the parterres of such symmetry, they are ordered in their species according to their kind." Throughout the 17th century and well into the next, the plantation of the Jardin du Roi was organized into discrete sections that contained, compartmentalized, and offered visual order. The physical contents of the garden, the plants, flowers, herbs, trees, shrubs, these were constantly in flux as new plant specimens were introduced. But throughout all of these changes and from season to season, the garden was arranged in an ornamental plantation scheme. As at other Northern European academic gardens, at Leiden and Oxford, the images of which you see on the screen, the Jardin du Roi was scholastic, it was utilitarian, and it was ornamental. And it was the primary physical repository for endemic herbs, flowers, and trees, and increasingly non-native specimens yielded from the projects of botanical imperialism and bioprospecting. What eluded Dodart and his fellow academicians was not a plantation scheme or the literal ordering of the ground, but a figurative order, a more philosophical problem. What they were lacking was a standardized system for classifying and naming botanical specimens. Over the course of the 17th century, botany emerged as a field of study distinct from medicine, as the study of plants was gradually divorced from their function or their use value. Only through experiential knowledge, wrote Dodart, would any attempt at organizing natural knowledge prove fruitful. In his engraved headpiece to Dodart's Natural History of Plants, Sébastien Leclerc attempted to visualize the observation-based practices espoused by Dodart and his peers in the text he was illustrating. Gathered around a table in a chemistry laboratory equipped with a furnace, an apothecary, scientific glassware, and plant specimens, members of the Royal Academy of Sciences collectively perform early modern natural history. They're pouring tinctures from vials, consulting pages from an open herbal, and finally putting to writing the group's experiential findings. And we're meant to understand that the site where all of this is happening is the Jardin du Roi in Paris. The collective European understanding of the edges of the world and its material contents, its geographies, its plants, animals, cultures, the understanding of these expanded greatly and rapidly over the course of the 17th century as European settler colonialism altered the ecosystems of the Americas, and in reverse, as material evidence from across the Atlantic was introduced into European gardens. Suddenly, botanical knowledge handed down from ancient Greek and Roman authorities no longer seemed sufficient or even accurate. Dodart lamented that the ancient Greek physician Dioscorides lacked thoroughness, that the physician Galen took liberties, and that the ancient Roman naturalist Pliny neither knew plants nor consulted anyone in his day who might have. In questioning the limits of received ancient botanical knowledge, early modern Europeans found the impetus to start again from scratch, to value received knowledge about the natural world only insofar as it could be verified through experience, The clear path forward, according to Dodart, was to supplement, even supersede received knowledge with experience by what he called one's own eyes. The process of going to the source, experimenting, drawing comparisons, and recording observations that Dodart recommended for scientists in his day is reflected here in the engraving by Leclerc. The Jardin du Roi, which, as I mentioned, opened to university faculty and the public in the 1630s, was not the first royal garden to serve that function in Paris, but an enlargement of a garden planted on the western end of the Ile de la Cité, seen here in a detail from the 1553 map of this city. And it's hard to make out, but it says Le Jardin du Roi right here. By 1600, the modest garden was tended by the multi-hyphenate gardener, apothecary, herbalist, and arborist Jean Robin for use by the court and the College of Physicians. In addition to medicinal herbs and plants, Robin cultivated exotic specimens, including those from North America he received through exchange from members in his naturalist network. And this included flora sent to him from French settlers in what is today Canada, and from his English acquaintances who had access to plants arriving from the mid-Atlantic region of what is today the United States. Robin also cultivated ornamental flowers, even collaborating in 1608 with royal embroiderer and engraver Pierre Vallet to produce a florilegium titled creatively, perhaps, Le Jardin du Roi, or the Royal Garden of the Very Christian Henry IV. This was a pattern book intended to provide embroiderers with ready floral patterns. But as a florilegium, a visual record of a particular garden, it also recorded what was growing in the Jardin du Roi in 1608 at the time. And we see one of the really beautifully and delicately rendered engravings by Vallet of an iris here on the right. And this is one of the plants that Robin would have cultivated or did cultivate for the royal garden. In his introduction to the florilegium, Vallet framed the project as a collaborative one between himself, and again, he was designer, engraver, embroiderer, so between himself and Robin the gardener. And we see that Vallet has included both of their portraits in the book. The early history, the foundation, the past of the Jardin du Roi in Paris, and its establishment in the first decades of the 17th century was, as I've pointed out, one that came about through the varied contributions of physicians, apothecaries, botanists, engravers, and embroiderers. Indeed, it looked to be the future of botanical studies too, according to Dodart, who identified the contributions of scholars and artisans alike as essential to advancing the field. Holding back advancements in the field, though, Dodart wrote, was the lack of standardized language and the abundance of non-regularized nomenclature. For him, the chaotic use of many different names for a single specimen negated attempts to taxonomize and impeded communication among communities of European naturalists, herbalists, agronomists, and gardeners across linguistic and even national borders. Dodart writes, "It seems one should ask the grammarians all the questions which are only of name, like those which depend on etymology. Those where we ask if a plant, of which we only know the name and the exterior, and that such an author calls by this name, is the same as this other author calls by another name, without saying anything else, to find out if such a plant has been known to such an author." To more accurately describe plant specimens, what was needed was the resurrection of antiquated words and the introduction into academic discourse of terms borrowed from the specialized lexicon of artisans. Dodart wrote, "We in France have many words significant to this matter, vocabularies that do not appear in books and were introduced into common parlance by painters, dyers, and weavers. Because color helps us recognize plants, we will use terms introduced into common use. It was all the more urgent to find new terms to nuance written descriptions of the seeds, roots, stems, and petals of flora, since printed botanicals were published in black and white. Though the physical shapes and contours of individual plant specimens could be conveyed in printed illustrations, colors and their gradations could not in the 17th century. To expand the vocabulary of naturalists in order to aid in characterizing, distinguishing, and grouping plants, Dodart called not only on his fellow academicians, but on artisans and practitioners. Importantly, Dodart published his natural history of plants not in the scientific language of Latin, but in vernacular French, and did so in order to reach the painters, dyers, and weavers, as well as gardeners, on whom they and their project fundamentally relied. Returning to Leclerc's engraving for Dodart's Natural History of Plants from 1676, I want to call your attention to what is happening just beyond the window, the direct observation of nature as depicted in the group of three men in the garden at right. They stand in a patterned parterre to examine more closely the individual plants that compose the garden. The object of their study is literally embedded in the undulating scrollwork of the parterre. 17th century maps and written descriptions by visitors to the garden suggest that the actual plantation was some combination of rectilinear rows and more complicated symmetrical patterns like we're looking at here. Such a heavy-handed or geometric plantation might today contrast with ideas that we have about naturalness or what is nature. Any garden, though, is ground that has been ordered, nature that has been manipulated to varying degrees through human intervention. And while a number of early modern philosophers and authors drew on pastoral elegiac traditions to express desires for a seeming naturalness, in truth, gardens across Northwestern Europe in the 17th century were ordered and figurative, like the ones that were like the one we're looking at here. In his engraving, Leclerc gestures not only to the academic work being performed by the botanists of the Royal Academy of Sciences in the parterres at the Jardin du Roi, but likewise to how the production and patterns of embroidered silk were integral to the early fabric of the garden. In the middle foreground of Leclerc's engraving stands an upholstered chair, a detail that seemingly does little to add to or advance the narrative. Covered in an embroidered floral pattern, the chair accommodates not a human sitter, but the tools of the naturalist. So we see a hat, a book, and most importantly, a single botanical print unfurling over the edge of the seat cushion. In placing the botanical print on top of the chair, on top of the embroidered fabric of the chair, Leclerc makes explicit the historical link between the two, that the illustration might well have been one designed by Vallée the embroiderer earlier in this century to serve as the model for the floral design of the chair's upholstery. So within this inner sanctum of the Royal Academy of Sciences, with the members at work in the Jardin du Roi, producing, standardizing, and institutionalizing knowledge about the natural world, the contributions of the arts are very much present. Leclerc's engraving is not the only visualization of learning happening in the garden, in the formal garden parterres of the Jardin du Roi. We see them too in Joseph Pitton de Tournefort's Elements of Botany, published in Paris in 1694. Tournefort trained as a physician, studying medicine and anatomy at the University of Montpellier in the south of France. He went on botanizing expeditions across Europe. He collected specimens from his travels and brought them back, and built his own herbarium, all of which brought him to the attention of the physician and botanist Guy Cresson-Fagon at the Jardin du Roi. who in 1683 offered Tournefort the position of chair of botany. Tournefort published his monumental Elements of Botany in 1694, and in this book, he introduced a new systematic approach to botanical classification, further subcategorizing plant families at the level of genus. In his system, plants were given a genus-level Latin name, followed by multiple descriptive words for species. And these were often still rather kind of unwieldy polynomial or composite names, though Tournefort recognized the need to further subdivide flora by type. He based his system of classification on the physical structures of individual specimens, and he only took into consideration the intrinsic property of plants, not extrinsic properties like their virtues or how they might be used by humans, especially in medicine. Though this might sound obvious to us today, this was a big moment in the history of botany, the differentiation between knowing and classifying plants, or knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and knowing how to use those plants. We see this separation of botany from medicine in Tournefort's description and corresponding illustration of the North American tree known today as the Robinia pseudoacacia, or black locust. I published on this tree, which was first introduced to Europe from Virginia around 1620, and it was named for Jean Robin, the early gardener at the Jardin du Roi. So it's Robinia from Robin. Tournefort's description of what he calls the pseudoacacia, or false acacia, is limited to the physical characteristics of the flowering tree in the legume family, and citations from the published works of previous botanists. His methodology extends to what he wanted illustrated in the Elements of Botany. He writes in the preface that if readers are surprised not to find anything about the virtues or the uses of plants in his treatise, they'll be further surprised to not find entire plants illustrated, only their parts. So the disposition of petals, the number of leaves, descriptions of seed pods, those characteristics that he deemed absolutely necessary to identifying the plant. And this is what we see in the pseudoacacia illustration. We don't see a tree in its entirety, but the parts of the tree that make it distinguishable from other trees, its leaves, pods, seeds, and blooms. This and the other botanical illustrations in the book were made by the engraver Claude Aubrier, who was the chief botanical illustrator at the Jardin du Roi around the turn of the 18th century. He worked closely with Tournefort, first illustrating his Elements of Botany, and later traveling abroad with the botanists throughout the Ottoman Empire. Tournefort appended a dictionary of botanical terms to the end of his treatise, composed of words drawn from the sciences and the arts. Any botanical resource, he argued, must also include the science of agriculture and the art of gardening. And so this is a through line that we're seeing, that the arts, along with other disciplines, are really essential to botany becoming botany. With his introduction of a new classification system based on categorizing plants by genus, Tournefort rendered Dodard's Natural History of Plants from 1676 irrelevant. Tournefort's taxonomic system was important. It was adopted in France and across Europe for the next few decades, until it was gradually replaced by the system of binomial nomenclature, the two-name system denoting genus and species, introduced by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in the mid-18th century. With classification based on different criteria, Linnaeus further subdivided genus into species, a kind of subgrouping or further taxa. And I bring this up to make the point that Tournefort's taxonomic work was highly significant to the development of systematic botany, even if Linnaeus's name is more familiar to us today. The Linnaean system of binomial nomenclature is the one we continue to use today, and Tournefort's is not. But the Linnaean system was built on the work of 17th century botanists, especially including that of the work of Tournefort. The engraved frontispiece to the Elements of Botany is as grandiose as you would expect a title page to be, with putti or winged infants acting as messengers announcing the publication. And these fantastical beings are paired with a bird's eye view of the Jardin du Roi in an image made by the Flemish engraver Cornelius Vermeulen, who worked for a time in Paris. Vermeulen specialized in engraved portraits, but he also made quite a few frontispieces for books, like the one we're looking at here. The inclusion of a recognizable rendering of the Jardin du Roi, rather than any kind of generic botanic garden, signals the centrality of this garden to Tournefort's work. It is the site from which he produced his most important work. And we see that the garden is little changed from the images earlier in the 1630s when it was established. This is one of my favorite 17th century images. And this and the previous were, I photographed these from the Lloyd's copy of the Elements of Botany. This is the headpiece to the treatise. So it's usually a smaller image at the beginning of a text, or sometimes it's used to signal a new chapter. It shows a lesson taking place in the herb garden at the Jardin du Roi. We see rectilinear rows of plants, a few trees, and several wells or cisterns for irrigation. We also notice two distinctly dressed groups of figures. So we see gardeners, the laborers who are responsible for the physical upkeep of the garden, and they're wearing smaller brimmed hats, clothes that don't have fancy buttons on them, and carrying tools. The other notable figures are scholars, and we see them gathered in the foreground. And we also see the professor holding court in the center of the image. He's distinct in his longer robe, and he commands the attention of the students as he speaks, gesturing with his cane to this specimen or that specimen. The students surrounding him take notes as they listen. And very interestingly, I think, one figure on the right is bent on a knee making sketches. And that figure is here. And then you see the detail again on the right. So the engraver has included an image of a botanical illustrator working on site at the Jardin du Roi, likely as Aubrier himself would have done in the process of illustrating Tournefort's Elements of Botany. There's an immediacy to the experiential knowledge these students are gaining outside with the garden as their classroom. You might also note that there are no women represented in this image. Formal training to be a botanist, a physician, or apothecary was largely not available to women who in the 17th century did not have such professional careers. This is an engraving, so it's created by an artist to illustrate and embellish Tournefort's treatise, but there are enough indications from written descriptions by visitors and engraved maps and various bird's eye views to glean that the illustrations reflect rather accurately the process of teaching and learning in the Jardin du Roi. By the end of the 17th century, the Paris Botanic Garden was as near to being encyclopedic or global in scope as any garden in Europe. The prestige of the garden, its enormous scale and its contents, and its foundational ties to the University of Paris attracted instructors and students from across Europe. As a leading taxonomist in the field of botany by the 1680s, Tournefort was a big part of that appeal, a big reason for coming to Paris and studying at the Jardin du Roi. He and his fellow instructors offered classes in the garden during the summers when plants were in bloom and the weather was hospitable to outdoor learning. Among the many students Tournefort taught during his tenure at the Jardin du Roi were the physician and botanist Paul Hermann, who held the chair of botany at the University of Leiden, and the English botanist William Sherard. Hermann, who traveled widely in the 1670s as a medical officer for the Dutch East India Company, wanted to develop a system of order for classifying the plant world that could then be reflected in the plantations at the garden at the University of Leiden. He was himself also a highly proficient botanical illustrator and engraver. These were skills that came in handy, of course, when he was traveling to what is today Sri Lanka with the Dutch East India Company. So he's both botanist and illustrator in one. Hermann published a catalog of all of the plants growing in the Leiden garden in 1687 before joining fellow student Gerard in Paris to study with Tournefort. Like many graduate student friendships, that between Hermann and Gerard proved long-lasting. Gerard would go on to edit and ensure that Hermann's revised catalog of the Leiden Botanic Garden was published after the author's death in 1695. And Gerard published his own Schola Botanica in 1689, a composite catalog of the Paris and Leiden Botanic Gardens. Though these might not sound stimulating or look very exciting, they were almost never illustrated. These functional garden catalogs that listed every plant growing at a particular moment in a particular garden, they're really fascinating for the history of botany. They're dashed off, often published quickly without frills, very often revised and republished. And they offer us an opportunity to look back on what had just been introduced, what was newly introduced, what was still unknown, what and why certain plants were named or renamed, this and that. In the preface to his Schola Botanica, Gerard offers us a glimpse of what it was like to attend Tournefort's lectures in Paris. He writes of the plants worshipped in the royal garden in Paris at the time of their flourishing in the months of June and July, at which time the most illustrious Lord Tournefort usually conducts public lectures. A most careful planter and storehouse of all natural history. During the 3 years that I spent in Paris, the botanical lectures of this most learned man, I myself diligently attended, and the nomenclatures of all the species and the series, which were arranged in the garden and by this praised man, a delightful spectacle indeed, and the greatest amusement of all botanists. Tournefort sounds like he would be the envy of professors today. So he was both delightful and amusing while also being learned and illustrious. When Gerard died in 1728, he endowed the first professorship of botany at Oxford, and the Gerardian chair of botany still exists to this day. So while Leiden and Oxford had academic botanic gardens, neither was as extensive or well-staffed at the turn of the 18th century as the one in Paris. And as I've mentioned, the taxonomist Tournefort held much appeal. And this will be my kind of segue into the research I did at the Lloyd Library earlier this year. On the first day of my fellowship, librarians Aaron Campbell and Patrick Ford took me up to see the treasures, the rarest and most valuable books in the collection. So any scholar or bibliophile knows the excitement of a moment like this. And as any well-prepared researcher does, I had gone through the online collection catalog prior to arriving in Cincinnati and came prepared with a hand-scribbled list of call numbers for the books that I was most excited to see. The one that really intrigued me was the one that the collection catalog informed me was a manuscript. So this was Lloyd Library MSS2, meaning that it was something written by hand. It had not been printed. When I got my hands on it, I saw that it was rather unremarkable in size. It's neither a tiny book that a naturalist might carry in a pocket on a field trip or while doing field work, nor was its binding very elaborate. And unlike so many of the splendid botanical books in the Lloyd's collection, it wasn't illustrated. So let's take a look at the first page and the lovely, but sometimes infuriating French script. We read at the top that it's a treatise of virtues, and virtues are uses. So a treatise of virtues of common plants demonstrated in the Jardin du Roi by Mr. Pitton de Tournefort, Doctor of Medicine on the Paris faculty and Professor of Botany in the Royal Academy of Sciences in the year 1708. So I was excited about this manuscript because of the connection to Tournefort. When I first looked it over, I assumed it was a copy or maybe select parts from Tournefort's major work, The Elements of Botany. But I soon realized this wasn't the case because the Lloyd manuscript addresses the medicinal uses of plants. So not about their nature, very little about their physical description or how you would identify them, things that are essential to botany. Nor does it seem to be a compilation of extracts from or notes on Tournefort's History of Plants that Grow Around Paris, which is something he published in 1698. And this History of Plants Around Paris describes the medicinal uses of common plants in the Ile-de-France region. So this is the region around Paris. The word treatise, the traité that you read at the top in the title, also made me think that this was likely copied from a published work. However, the discours or address that you see just below suggests otherwise, and I've translated it here. I hope, gentlemen, that those of you who intend to take this course will permit me to present to you a treatise on the virtues of common plants that contains several practical observations. But as we only have 6 weeks to work on the subject, you will allow me to focus only on what is most useful about the most common plants. So this is an address from an instructor to a student, almost like a syllabus handed out at the beginning of the semester. It outlines the goals and the limitations of this 6-week course on the virtue or uses of common plants growing in the Jardin du Roi in 1708. The Lloyd manuscript appears to be notes from a class taught by Tournefort in the Jardin du Roi, and a class not about nomenclature or classification, not about botany, but about the medicinal uses of plants. So even if Tournefort rejected the virtues of plants in incorporating those into his botanical classification system, he was still trained as a physician, right? So this was knowledge he had and knowledge that he continued to perpetuate throughout his career. To give you an idea of the contents of the manuscript, I'll take the example of one of the plants described. This is the pulegium or pennyroyal, which is a kind of mint. And what you read after you see pulegium, it's a list of sources and what each of them has to say about the plant, how the plant can be used to cure this or that. In the case of the pulegium, it can cure an upset stomach. So-and-so says it can be combined with equal parts water and honey to cure an eye infection. Someone else says it can cure the cough of children. Written off to the side are these, what I found to be really interesting parenthetical notes that act almost like a footnote does in scholarship today, offering further information and citing the source. To the left, we see that the author has written CB, referring to the important Swiss botanist Caspar Bauham, and he writes that CB calls this plant the Clinopodium. Bauham died in 1624, long before the author of the Lloyd manuscript wrote these notes, which means that Bauham was known to the author through the books he published. So he's a kind of modern authority, a new authority on botany. That which Bauham called the Clinopodium at the beginning of the century was now being called the pulegium. And this gives us an idea of how confusing these different naming systems were, these systems that Dodar was complaining about. To complicate things further, the entry on the pulegium, there's another note on the entry on the pulegium, and this one reads, Les Mairies calls it wild basil. And this is where it gets especially interesting because the Les Mairies referred to here is either the chemist and apothecary Nicolas Les Mairies or his son, who was also a chemist and apothecary. And the son, Louis Les Mairies, trained with his father, and he also trained with Tournefort. In 1675, Nicolas Lemery, the father, published a book called Chemistry Lessons, in which he rejected what he called the obscurity that plagued the chemical arts of the past in favor of the experiential. This shift to philosophical chemistry, or modern chemistry, mirrors similar changes happening to botany at the same time. Lemery taught chemistry lessons from his apothecary shop located near the Jardin du Roi. So as a chemist and apothecary, he had professional interest in medicinal compounds. And in 1698, he published his Universal Pharmacopoeia. And this is a pharmacopoeia is a book on medical compounds, in which Lemery gave further insight into how plant knowledge was taught at the Jardin du Roi. He dedicated his book to Guy Cresson-Fagon, the same Fagon who summoned Tournefort from Montpellier to teach at the Jardin du Roi. So this is what Lemery writes. We have not forgotten these learned and judicious lessons that you once gave in the royal garden on the subject that I am treating, and from which I admit I have drawn much from you. With such clarity, how easily you impart your most sublime thoughts to this crowd of listeners who come from all parts of the world to benefit from your enlightenment. We can say, sir, that you are the first to put forward good and reputable remedies. You have developed them from the confusion in which those who preceded you left them. So here again, we learn that botanical lessons taught in the Jardin du Roi happened during the summer months, that these classes were filled with students from all parts of the world. We also get an indication of the frustrations, another indication of the frustrations experienced by the lack of standardization across the natural sciences. So echoes of the kind of chaos and confusion that Dodart attempted to address. That the Lloyd manuscript is titled a treatise signals the systematic analysis of the medicinal use of plants. This makes sense, as it's how a taxonomist like Tournefort would approach the subject. I assume that the contents of the manuscript would be grouped according to their uses, their medicinal properties, like grouped according to cure, but they aren't. Instead, they're organized according to family. And this isn't stated, this isn't explicit anywhere, but after going back and cross-referencing the common names written down in the treatise with the Linnaean names used today, I realized that they are all part of the Lamaceae family or the mint family. So my best guess is that this is how the plants were physically organized in the Jardin du Roi in 1708 by family. And that these notes are a way we can imagine kind of walking from plant to plant in the garden. But I still needed to figure out exactly what the Lloyd manuscript was. My first question was whether it could have been from 1708, as the title indicates, or was it instead something that had been copied down later, perhaps in the 19th century? I'm not a paleographer, so trying to decipher the age of the handwriting wasn't going to happen for me. And with no additional metadata, I was left with only the physical book itself. I was lucky enough a few summers ago to attend a rare book school at UCLA. And one of the things I took from this course was that the materiality of books can speak to us beyond the printed words, even centuries on. So I looked to see if the pages of the manuscript had a watermark, a design, or a signature of the papermaker. And so armed with iPhone cameras, Lloyd archivist Christine Jankowski helped me backlight and photograph one of the pages. And as you can see from the image on the right, especially, we saw there was a clear watermark. After trying in vain to blow up the pictures and combine them to create some kind of legible image, something that I could make sense of, Christine took matters into her own hands and provided me with the composite image we see on the right. And suddenly the watermark was much more legible. It's a central figure holding some kind of globe or orb, wearing an oversized crown, and surrounded by two winged griffins, these mythological lion-eagle beasts. And I was left with the same question you probably have. So what? What does this mean? And when I asked Lloyd librarian Patrick Ford if he might be able to point me in the direction of a resource to make sense of this watermark, he very helpfully located a similar watermark in an online database of European paper production. And what we found was, to the best of our knowledge, the most similar watermark comes from paper made in Luxembourg in the year 1700. So I believe this book to be the notes of a physician or apothecary in training, perhaps from Luxembourg or somewhere else along the northeastern borders of France. I think it was written in 1708, as the title page suggests. And I think it's likely notes taken while attending a summer course in the Jardin du Roi with Tournefort. If my assumption is correct, these are notes from what would have been the last summer Tournefort gave botanical lessons in the garden, as he was very unfortunately crushed to death by a carriage not far from the Jardin du Roi in December of 1708 at the age of 52. Through his published works and on-site teaching, Tournefort was explicit about the need to distinguish botany from medicine. This way of thinking about plants was critical to the emergence of the modern academic discipline that we know today. But this thinking did not emerge from a vacuum. It was a gradual process of trial and error over time. And it was the result, by necessity, of a collective effort. No one person in the 17th century could travel the world or could access all of the plants or all of the knowledge about plants. So, thinking about botany as something that's not attributable to a single person, author, or thinker, and also as one that was not exclusive to those who published or held academic positions. Not only did artisans, apothecaries, and gardeners and botanical illustrators benefit from new and revised knowledge about plants, they also contributed to and circulated new knowledge. It is, I think, important to remember that as plant knowledge developed, was systematized and institutionalized, and as the emerging field of botany experienced the growing pains, the disorder, the chaos that comes with new ways of thinking about the natural world, knowledge circulated through channels like this manuscript, likely made in the Jardin du Roi, and perhaps taken back home, perhaps somewhere far from Paris, where Tournefort's ideas on plant families and their uses to medicine continue to circulate. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. That was fascinating. It was really fun to hear as well because, for the people in the audience, I was somebody that was lucky enough to be there when you were making some of these discoveries. And as a gardener, I took a lot of pride in the fact that, as you pointed out in your conclusion and throughout your program tonight, that botanical knowledge was a collective effort and that the gardeners were a group that played a very influential role in that. So again, I was very lucky to be part of, as you were piecing this story together, and also very glad that your research was a collective effort as well. And I really appreciate your shout outs to the people on the Lloyd staff and the role they played, especially with that watermark. That was, all of it was fun, but the watermark.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of the, you have to know your own limits and hope that the resources out there are ones that the expertise of others is something you can take advantage of. So, right, this was really crucial to my thinking because I would have assumed this was from the 19th century. I would have assumed it was later.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about the structure of gardens and that sort of thing. So, is it a coincidence or related or not? The
Mhm.
fact that at the same time that botanists and gardeners and physicians and pharmacists are looking for some sort of system where we call things by the same name, we realize we're dealing with the same plant. You can certainly see somebody in the field of medicine why that would be important.
Mhm.
And the gardens themselves being so highly structured, lines and that sort of thing. Do you see those two things as related, or is it just
I do. I really do. I think, there were a few examples that I was able to mention this evening, but there are so many in writing about the chaos, the disorder, the messiness. And I think one way to address this is in these highly ordered gardens, right? That provide a frame or a structure, and where plants can be changed out, or if something doesn't, if something has come from a cold part of Canada and doesn't take in France, in Paris, or in Montpellier, can be changed out for something else. Yeah, I absolutely do think that the formal order is a stand-in for trying, looking for a system, looking for a classification system that can provide order.
so the another question that I had and that I found so appealing about your lecture is I really like when something is like a little bit beyond what you see with maybe the naked eye or you see first looking, and the way that you zoomed in and you looked at these different elements. And you're not the only, or I shouldn't say it like that. Other scholars and artists in residence have done recently similar things with our books. They take magnifying glasses up to the frontispieces or some of the engravings. And it is incredible some of the things that you see sort of embedded and hidden in there. Um, One of the things that I found interesting about what you said was that, I think sometimes we think of they're very beautiful and we think of them as very glamorized or idealized, and there's angels and cherubs and
Right.
stuff like that. But I was really fascinated by the fact that you said at the same time, at least some of them very accurately reflect what is really going on. And in fact, so much so that, I can think of at least one, actually, a couple of books that when you do the same thing and look into this engraving, there are slaves in the background, so there are things like you mentioned, there are no women in here. You can
Mhm.
see the workers. And so things are, at least to some extent, accurately represented. And then there's other things like the one example you gave that it is more like symbolic, the botanical illustration sitting on the upholstery. So my question is, do you have a sense of what the intent of the engravers were when they made these very elaborate, detailed images that you might literally have to take a magnifying glass to see um, something that's maybe significant?
Um, Generally, I would say no, I don't know what the intent is. What I would assume is it's a combination of trying to achieve a kind of artistic merit. So making something that's beautiful, that if you're flipping through a book that's just page after page after page of text, you stop for a moment. It's like, okay, this is a figurative illustration. This is something I understand, right? I don't have to use my brain as much for this. Um, and in some cases, there are instances in which illustrators or engravers were working on commission. So they were trying to meet the needs of the author, or meet the needs of the publisher. Um, yeah, so I think As for the frontispiece you mentioned with the putti and then the garden itself, I think that Paris is very important there. That a generic garden wouldn't have served the same purpose, right? Because there are bits of the garden, if you had have just taken out a detail, it could have been any kind of pleasure garden or any botanic garden anywhere in Europe. But that it was very important for the primary image on the cover of Tournefort's treatise to signal Paris, to signal this specific garden in Paris.
So I am thinking, like, again, what I just to, like you said in your program, to look beyond the words. So there are things in there that tell you something about the values, etc., what the person is trying to express.
Right, right. And the way the words and images contextualize and recontextualize each other, right? When they're understood together.
So I have a question from Emily. She said,
Okay.
this is an impressive breadth of knowledge in botanical history. Thanks for the talk. Is there any indication which kind of plants might be included in a decorative parterre as opposed to linear rows? Is it aesthetic, functional / medicinal versus ornamental?
Um, at in a botanic garden or in an academic garden, like the Jardin du Roi, I think most often the showiest, most beautiful flowers would have been the ones planted in the more ornamental kind of curvilinear patterns. And and this would also include things that were valued or things that were considered exotic. And I think if you remember back to the headpiece for the Tournefort, where he's teaching in the garden, and you just see those rows that are kind of partitioning and dividing by family. I think these would have been like the very common herbs that had long been known and long been in use. But thank you for that question.
So Lauren, I want to thank you again for a wonderful program. I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us tonight. I would like to point out that programs like these are supported by members of the Lloyd Library. If you're a member, thank you very much, or a donor. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join. You can find information on our website. And for more programs presented by the Lloyd Library and Museum, visit the Lloyd Library's YouTube channel. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel, and everyone that's registered for this webinar will receive a notification when it is live. To all of you, we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.